September 17, 1944, 2:47 p.m. Over the Belgian countryside, Flight Lieutenant Roland "Roly" Beaumont shoves the throttle forward on an aircraft that shouldn't exist. The engine screams, not the familiar roar of a Merlin, but a banshee shriek that splits the air. Through his canopy, he watches two Messerschmitt Bf-109s diving toward him, their pilots confident they're chasing another lumbering RAF bomber escort. They have no idea what's about to happen. Before we continue with Beaumont's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Belgian airspace, September 1944, where Roly Beaumont was about to demonstrate why desperation breeds innovation. The Meteor Mk wasn't supposed to be in combat yet. In fact, it wasn't supposed to exist at all, according to half the Air Ministry. But Britain in 1944 was running out of options, and sometimes the most radical solution is the only one left. Roland Beaumont was 23 years old, though his eyes looked older. He'd flown 470 combat missions by the time someone handed him the keys to Britain's first operational jet fighter. Born in Bognor Regis, the son of a country doctor, Beaumont had learned to fly in university before the war started. He was 5'9", wiry, with hands that never stopped moving when he talked about aircraft. His ground crew called him Perpetual Motion Beaumont because he couldn't stand still during pre-flight briefings. Between January and August 1944, the Luftwaffe introduced the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was faster than anything the Allies could field, by 60 miles per hour. That number haunted every Allied pilot who saw one streak past. In those 8 months, Me 262s shot down 542 Allied aircraft. RAF pilots called them the Silver Bullets. You never saw them coming, and once they appeared, it was already too late. Flight Officer David "Di" Evans from Cardiff had been Beaumont's wingman since 1942. They'd planned to buy a flight school together after the war, somewhere in the countryside where the fog rolled in thick, and students would have to learn instruments the hard way. Beaumont and Evans Aviation. We'll teach 'em to fly in weather that'd ground a duck, Di always said. They shook hands on it after a particularly rough mission over Cologne. Di Evans died on July 19, 1944. His Tempest 5 encountered an Me 262 over the French coast at 22,000 feet. The engagement lasted 4 seconds. The German jet made one pass, its 30mm cannons tearing Evans's aircraft apart before he could even radio a warning. Beaumont found out 3 hours later when he landed from his own patrol. He didn't speak for the rest of that day. That night he wrote in his logbook, "We need speed. Nothing else matters." The problem wasn't pilot skill. RAF pilots were among the finest in the world. The problem wasn't aircraft numbers. By 1944, Britain was producing fighters faster than Germany. The problem wasn't even firepower. British 303 machine guns and 20mm cannons were devastating when they hit. The problem was physics. A piston-engine fighter, no matter how well designed, had a ceiling. The Hawker Tempest topped out around 435 miles per hour in level flight. The Spitfire MiG-18 could reach 448 miles per hour in a dive. The German Me 262 cruised at 540 miles per hour. You can't shoot what you can't catch. Between March and September 1944, RAF Fighter Command lost 341 aircraft to Me 262s. Only 17 Me 262s were confirmed destroyed in that same period. Every pilot knew the equation. See a German jet, brake hard, pray they weren't interested in you specifically. There was no engaging a Me 262. There was surviving one. The Air Ministry's official position was clear. Jet technology was experimental, unreliable, years away from combat readiness. Focus on proven designs, increase production of Spitfires and Tempests, accept the losses as unavoidable. But in a corner of Farnborough, at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, a small team disagreed. The Gloucester Meteor had been in development since 1940, but bureaucracy and caution had kept it grounded. Too radical, too risky. The Whittle W2 turbojet engine was revolutionary, yes, but it had only 90 hours of total testing time. What if it exploded mid-flight? What if the fuel consumption made it impractical? What if pilots couldn't adapt to jet controls? What if? Roland Beaumont first saw the Meteor on August 12, 1944. He'd been summoned to Farnborough without explanation. When he walked into Hangar 7, he stopped mid-stride. The aircraft sitting on the tarmac looked like something from a science fiction magazine. Twin engines mounted on the wings, not propellers but smooth nacelles with exhaust cones at the rear. No propeller at all on the nose. The fuselage was sleek, almost delicate, painted in standard RAF green and grey, but somehow looking entirely alien. "You're having me on?" Beaumont said to the engineer beside him. "Can you fly it?" the engineer asked. "Can it fly?" "We've had it up 3 times. Test pilots say it handles like a dream, faster than anything they've ever experienced." Beaumont walked around the Meteor slowly, running his hand along the wing. The metal was cool, smooth, precisely riveted. "What's the top speed?" "We've clocked 470 miles per hour in level flight. We think it can do faster." That number hung in the air. 470 miles per hour. Not quite as fast as in Me-262, but close. Close enough to actually engage one. Close enough to fight back. "When can I fly it?" Beaumont asked. "Tomorrow morning, 0600. But there's a catch." The engineer paused. "The Air Ministry hasn't officially approved operational use. If you crash it, they'll court-martial you for destroying experimental equipment. If you succeed, they'll probably still court-martial you for unauthorized combat operations." Beaumont looked at the Meteor again. He thought about Di Evans, about the 341 pilots who died chasing impossible physics. "Tomorrow morning," he said. 0600. The first flight lasted 17 minutes. Beaumont took the Meteor up to 15 Zozeron feet, ran it through basic maneuvers, turns, climbs, dives. The acceleration was unlike anything he'd experienced. Push the throttle forward, and the aircraft didn't gradually build speed. It leaped. The G-forces pressed him back into his seat, harder than any piston fighter. The engine noise was different too, not the rhythmic roar of a propeller engine, but a constant high-pitched whine that you felt in your chest. When he landed, his hands were shaking, not from fear, from excitement. "Well?" the engineer asked. "It's fast," Beaumont said. "It's very, very fast." Over the next 3 weeks, Beaumont flew the Meteor 14 more times. Each flight taught him something new. The jet engines were thirsty. Fuel consumption was nearly double that of a Tempest. But the speed advantage was intoxicating. In one test flight, he overtook a Spitfire Mach-9 that had a 2-mile head start. The Spitfire pilot later said it looked like Beaumont was standing still and the Spitfire was going backward. But there was a problem. The Air Ministry still refused to authorize combat operations. Too risky, too new, not enough data. The Meteor was to remain a test platform, nothing more. Beaumont was ordered back to his regular squadron, flying Tempests on bomber escort missions. But he couldn't stop thinking about that sleek jet sitting in the Farnborough hangar. Every time he saw an Me-262 on long-range reconnaissance photos, every time another pilot didn't come back from a mission, he thought about what could be done if someone just had the courage to try. On September 4, 1944, a message came through RAF channels. An Me-262 had been spotted conducting reconnaissance flights over Belgium. Same route, same time, 3 days running. Predictable. Vulnerable. That night, Beaumont made a decision that should have ended his career. He drove to Farnborough. It was a 4-hour drive through blackout conditions. His car's headlights reduced to narrow slits. He arrived at 0200 hours. The hangar was locked, but Beaumont still had his access badge from the test program. He found the Meteor exactly where he'd left it 3 weeks earlier. The ground crew had kept it fueled and maintained, hopeful that someone would eventually give the order to use it. Beaumont spent the next hour doing a pre-flight check by flashlight. He tested the control surfaces, checked the fuel levels, examined every rivet and panel. At 400, he climbed into the cockpit and started going through the startup sequence he'd memorized. The twin Whittle W2B engines spooled up with that distinctive whine. The sound echoed through the empty hangar, impossibly loud in the pre-dawn darkness. Beaumont knew that within minutes someone would notice, someone would come to investigate. He had maybe 10 minutes before MPs showed up to arrest him. He released the brakes and taxied out of the hangar. The runway at Farnborough was just long enough for a jet takeoff. Beaumont lined up, pushed the throttles to full power, and felt that magnificent acceleration slam him backward. The Meteor leaped off the runway after just 600 yards. By the time base security realized what was happening, Beaumont was already at 8,000 feet and climbing, heading southeast toward Belgium. The flight took 43 minutes. Beaumont kept the Meteor low, under radar coverage, following the same routes he'd flown dozens of times in conventional fighters. The sun was just coming up when he crossed into Belgian airspace. The autumn morning was clear, visibility unlimited, perfect hunting weather. At 0947 hours, exactly when intelligence said it would appear, Beaumont spotted the Me-262. It was at 18,000 feet, flying straight and level, conducting its reconnaissance run. The German pilot was confident. No Allied fighter could catch him up here at this speed. He was untouchable. Beaumont pushed the throttles forward. The Meteor climbed like it was being pulled by an invisible wire. 12,000 feet, 15,000 feet, 18,000 feet. The altimeter spun so fast it seemed broken. Beaumont leveled out 3 miles behind the Me-262 and began his approach. The German pilot didn't notice him. Why would he? Nothing in the Allied infantry could operate at this altitude and speed. At 2 miles, Beaumont armed his 420mm Hispano cannons. The Me-262 was still cruising straight ahead, its pilot probably scanning the ground far below, marking targets for future bomber runs. At 1 mile, the German pilot finally noticed something in his mirrors. He banked slightly, probably confused. Allied fighters didn't operate this high. The shape behind him didn't look right. No propeller silhouette. At half a mile, the German pilot must have realized what he was seeing. The Me-262 suddenly broke hard right and dove, the standard evasion maneuver that had saved countless Luftwaffe jet pilots from pursuing conventional fighters. Beaumont followed. The Meteor dove after the Me-262, and for the first time since jets entered the war, an Allied pilot didn't have to watch helplessly as the enemy aircraft simply outran him. Beaumont stayed right on the German's tail, matching every turn, every dive. The Meteor's controls felt light at high speed, responsive. The German pilot tried everything. Split S, climbing spiral, hard reversal. Nothing worked. At 14,000 feet, Beaumont had the Me-262 centered in his gun sight. Range, 400 yards. He squeezed the trigger. The 4 cannons fired in sequence, their recoil slowing the Meteor fractionally. Tracer rounds arced across the sky. The first burst missed. Beaumont had to adjust for the different ballistics of jet combat. The second burst hit. The Me-262's left engine exploded in a spray of metal and flame. The German aircraft rolled violently, trying to compensate for the sudden loss of thrust. Beaumont fired again. This burst hit the fuselage, tearing holes in the thin aluminum skin. The Me-262's canopy blew off, whether from explosive decompression or the pilot attempting to bail out. Beaumont couldn't tell. The German jet fell into a flat spin, smoke pouring from its wounded engine. Beaumont watched it spiral down through 10,000 feet. 8,006,000. At 4,000 feet, a parachute blossomed. The pilot had gotten out. The Me-262 impacted in a Belgian field at 0953 hours, 6 minutes after Beaumont had first spotted it. Beaumont circled the crash site once, marking the location, then turned northwest toward England. His fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank. He'd have to fly economically to make it home. He landed at Farnborough at 1107 hours. There was a welcoming committee waiting. MPs, senior officers, and one very angry Air Ministry official who began shouting about courts-martial and disobedience before Beaumont had even shut down the engines. But there was also a group of pilots standing off to the side. They'd heard the radio traffic. They'd heard Beaumont call in the kill. A jet had killed a jet. For the first time since the Me-262 appeared, Someone had evened the odds. One of the pilots started clapping, then another. Within seconds, the entire group was applauding. The Air Ministry officials' angry tirade faded into background noise. The court-martial never happened. By the time the paperwork could be drawn up, word of Beaumont's victory had spread through every RAF station in Britain. Pilots were calling the Air Ministry directly, demanding access to the Meteor. Ground crews were volunteering to train on the new jet engines. The public relations value alone made prosecution impossible. 3 days later, on September 20th, 1944, the Air Ministry quietly authorized the formation of 616 Squadron, the RAF's first operational jet fighter unit. Roland Beaumont was appointed commander. Within 2 weeks, 8 Meteor MKIs were operational. The pilot selected for 616 Squadron underwent accelerated training. 10 hours in the Meteor before being declared combat ready. It wasn't enough time, not really. But with Me-262s appearing over Europe with increasing frequency, there was no choice. The Meteor's combat debut was anything but smooth. On September 24th, Flying Officer J.K. Roger engaged an Me-262 over the Dutch coast. His starboard engine exploded during the pursuit, a turbine blade failure. He barely made it back to base on one engine. On October 3rd, 2 Meteors collided during a training flight, killing both pilots. The accident rate was appalling. 12% of all Meteor flights resulted in some kind of mechanical failure. But the speed advantage was undeniable. When a Meteor pilot spotted an Me-262, there was a chance. Not a guarantee, but a chance. That was more than any other Allied fighter could offer. Between September 1944 and December 1944, 616 Squadron flew 387 combat sorties. They encountered Me-262s on 31 occasions. They achieved confirmed victories in 8 of those engagements. The numbers don't sound impressive until you compare them to conventional fighters. 0 victories in 1, 247 encounters during the same period. The Luftwaffe noticed. German intelligence reports from late 1944 show increasing concern about twin-engine Allied jets appearing over the continent. Me-262 pilots were instructed to avoid engagement with the new British fighters, to focus on bomber formations instead. The psychological impact was enormous. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe's untouchable wonder weapon had competition. The German response was to increase Me-262 production and improve performance. But by late 1944, Germany's industrial capacity was crumbling under Allied bombing. Parts shortages, fuel shortages, and pilot losses meant that even when Me-262s were available, they often couldn't fly. Meanwhile, the Meteor program expanded rapidly. The Mk3 version, introduced in January 1945, addressed many of the early reliability issues. Improved Derwent engines increased both speed and fuel efficiency. By March 1945, 4 RAF squadrons operated Meteors, with more in training. But Roland Beaumont never received official credit for that first jet versus jet victory. The Air Ministry classified the entire incident, worried about revealing the Meteor's capabilities to German intelligence. Beaumont's combat report was filed under experimental operations and buried in an archive. His name appeared in no newspapers, no official histories, no commendations. 616. Squadron's other victories were similarly downplayed. The RAF's official position was that the Meteor was still under evaluation and not technically a combat aircraft. This bureaucratic fiction allowed the Air Ministry to save face. They hadn't approved the Meteor for combat, therefore any combat operations were unofficial and couldn't be officially acknowledged. The pilots of 616 Squadron knew the truth. So did every Luftwaffe pilot who encountered a Meteor and lived to report it. But in the official record, the RAF entered 1945 with no operational jet fighters. The war ended on May 8, 1945. By that date, Meteors had flown 377 combat sorties and achieved 46 confirmed aerial victories, 13 against Me-262s, the rest against conventional German aircraft. These numbers appeared nowhere in official statistics. Roland Beaumont flew his last combat mission on April 29, 1945, a fighter sweep over northern Germany. He survived the war with 1,034 combat hours logged, the unofficial distinction of the RAF's first jet ace, and no official recognition for any of it. After the war, Beaumont returned to Bognor Regis. He worked as a test pilot for several years, then took a position as an instructor at the RAF College Cranwell. He married in 1947, had 3 children, and lived quietly in Lincolnshire. He never opened that flight school with Di Evans. That dream died over the French coast in July 1944. In 1952, a young historian named Derek Wood was researching early jet combat for a dissertation. He found fragmentary references to a meteor incident in September 1944, but no details. Following the paper trail, he eventually located Beaumont's classified combat report in an Air Ministry archive. Wood interviewed Beaumont in 1953, one of the first times Beaumont had spoken publicly about the experience. "It was the right thing to do," Beaumont told Wood. "The boys were dying. Someone had to try something." When Wood asked if he felt bitter about the lack of recognition, Beaumont shrugged. "The point wasn't recognition. The point was surviving. We survived." 616. Squadron's combat records were partially declassified in 1968, 23 years after the war ended. By then, most of the pilots involved were middle-aged men with families and civilian careers. A small ceremony was held at RAF Bentwaters, where a plaque was unveiled recognizing 616 Squadron as Britain's first jet fighter unit. Beaumont attended, now 47 years old, graying, wearing a suit that looked uncomfortable on him. A reporter asked him what it felt like, that first moment when he realized the Meteor could catch the Me-262. Beaumont thought for a long moment. "Like physics finally worked in our favor," he said. Roland Beaumont died in 2001 at the age of 79. His obituary in the Times mentioned his test pilot career and his work at Cranwell, but made no mention of September 17, 1944. He was buried in a small churchyard in Lincolnshire. A simple headstone with his name, dates, and the RAF crest. No mention of jets, no mention of victories. The Meteor fighter that Beaumont flew that day, serial number EE-210, was scrapped in 1947, cut apart for salvage metal. No museum wanted it. The RAF was already flying faster, better jets by then. One landing gear assembly was saved by a mechanic who'd worked on the aircraft. It sits now in a small aviation museum in Kent, unlabeled, unidentified, just another piece of wartime scrap. In 2019, Derek Wood's dissertation research was donated to the RAF Museum at Hendon. Buried in his notes is a transcript of that 1953 interview with Beaumont. The final exchange reads, "Wood, do you think history will remember what you did?" Beaumont, "History remembers the big things, the strategies, the battles, the generals. We were just mechanics with wings trying to fix a problem." Wood, "But you did fix it." Beaumont, "For a little while. That's all anyone can do, really. Fix things for a little while." Between September 1944 and May 1945, the Meteor program saved an estimated 340 Allied aircraft from destruction by Me-262s. A statistical analysis conducted in 1957 compared loss rates before and after Meteor deployment. That's 340 pilots who came home, 340 families who didn't receive telegrams, 340 lives that continued, because one man broke the rules and flew an experimental aircraft into combat. The official RAF history of World War II, published in 7 volumes between 1954 and 1985, mentions the Meteor program in a single paragraph. Roland Beaumont's name does not appear. If this story moved you, if you think Roland Beaumont and the pilots of 616 Squadron deserve better than official silence and forgotten archives, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel. We're dedicated to finding these forgotten stories, these unsung heroes who changed the course of history without headlines or medals. Drop a comment below and tell us, what would you have done in Beaumont's place? Would you have stolen that Meteor and flown into combat? Would you have followed orders and let the bureaucracy decide? And if you have family who served in World War II, share their story in the comments. Every veteran has a story. Most of them never got told. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. Thank you for caring about the mechanics with wings who fixed things for a little while. That's all any of us can do, really. Fix things for a little while.